Hello, everyone, and welcome. And yes, I know I was supposed to have this out to you last night, but if I'm being honest, I fell asleep and didn't get it done until today. So here we are. Um, Social movements. If you're in a different class, you're in the wrong video. How's that? It's been a little while since I've spoken with you. I've been sending you a lot of readings, and I have been asking you to discuss some things on Blackboard, and then I found myself really caught up in what you were saying on Blackboard. And I was like, I should respond to all of this, and it just became one of those things where it was like, well, if I respond to one of you, I should respond to all of you because all of you deserve that equal time. And I had so many different things to say. And I realized that what's important is that you all have put out there your thoughts and ideas. My thoughts or responses to that are not nearly as important. So instead, I thought I'll just continue going on with content. And right now, I don't really think we have a whole lot coming up on the calendar. I was just trying to check it out before I logged onto the screen here. The syllabus is not necessarily, we're not tied to it necessarily. And finding social movements is difficult for me, but here it is. I have some reading material. Why do I have that? Oh, that's in the announcements. My bad. All right, here we go. So, on your syllabus, if you want to look at that and follow along with me, it is currently week 5, where we're supposed to talk about social media and social movements. And it says there's an assignment due 5/17/21. Pretty sure I meant 2/17/21, but I'm going to push that back a little bit so you don't need to worry. But we'll stay on track for the syllabus here. So, I wanted to catch up a few things before we moved on. And one of those things was that we had talked about different ways of defining social movements or what different characteristics make up social movements. And some of those are, in fact, debatable. I think I said that before. For example, the idea of an uninstitutionalized group is questionable. I mean, some things that are already institutionalized, and in our definition, that means somehow part of the government, are still movements. The environmental movement didn't die when we got the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, right? And it didn't stop when there were two bills for the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. It didn't stop when the EPA started giving out carbon emission standards, particularly in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, et cetera, who have big auto industry, steel industry, et cetera. That was, at the time putting a lot of pollutants into the air. Pittsburgh, of course, has switched to fracking because apparently we really like destroying our own land. The questions about different human practices that we have having an environmental impact is not new. It's part of a very large cyclical, if you will, movement that continues on and goes through, in my opinion, a lot of different stages. Different scholars will tell you that there are stages of movements, as few as 3 to as many as 7. I gave you a list of Stuart Smith and Denton's 5 stages of a social movement, and I wanted to talk about those because that's the one that I ascribe to the most, although my views are changing. Those are the ones I'm most familiar with. So as you do readings for this class, you may find other sources that talk about different stages of a social movement and the way that it functions at different times. So this is just like one of those options. This is not, gospel. I don't want to put it that way. So we know that movements can go through several different sort of stages in their life. There's a couple of ways that those stages can go. They can be start to finish linear progression. They could be cyclical. They could be cyclonic. They could be, those are really the biggest ways that they can go, right? Those 3 are the main ways that they can go: linear, cyclical, or cyclonic. And I used to think that it was cyclical, that a movement would go through all 5 stages. All 5 stages. all 5 stages. And I've learned that it doesn't. In fact, one of the things I've learned probably more than anything is that the termination stage, as it is described by Stuart Smith and Denton, and I'll get to that in a second, is the end of the movement. And I find that movements less often end and more often change. They become something a little bit different, but based on the same values and principles of the original movement. For example, the environmental movement that I just talked about, I don't think that it died or terminated and then restarted. I think that the environmental movement as a whole has these values that over time haven't changed, but have impacted or led us to interpret things a different way, which means that we need more legislation, or we need more regulation, or we need to control certain things that we're doing in order to help our environment in multiple ways, whether that's clean air, clean water, stopping the deforestation of the rainforest, whether it's finding a way to grow food in desert and arid areas, whatever that is, those are all part of the same value of preserving the earth and the atmosphere. Okay. So, or if not preserving it, improving it. So all of that means that it's still part of the environmental movement. It's just going through some different stages of development, or new challenges that have come up and addressing those, or in some cases, yes, passing new law and regulations in order to help it. So let's talk about those 5 stages that I just mentioned. They're the ones I'm the most familiar with. They starts off with something called Genesis. I've seen other scholars refer to this part of it as sort of an inception of ideas. There has to be something that starts to trigger the social thought that there's a need for change. Okay, so there has to be sort of an undercurrent, a rumbling of something starting. It's not necessarily visible yet as a movement. That doesn't happen really until the second stage in Stuart Smith and Denton. But I've seen people describe Inception as, just like you would in the movie Inception, that kernel or seed in a dream, planting an idea that could then change the entire course of someone's history. So that idea of inception or genesis, whatever we want to call it, undercurrent, all of those are talking about the same thing. And that is before the movement really gets going. And there's just some ideas about it. Some people might argue that it's a dark or an alternative idea, or a new wave or a new age course of thought. We get that a lot, particularly in environmental movements, in health movements, holistic health movements, and even in some cases in civil rights movements. Okay. And sometimes that's for necessity. Sometimes people who belong to certain groups that start movements need to do it quietly at first, either for their own comfort or their own safety. Just depending on how radical it seems to be by current social standards. Okay, so we have this idea of Genesis. Something's coming. Something important is coming up. There's an issue that's becoming more problematic, or is growing in intensity, or that is becoming more well known. From there, we get social unrest. And social unrest means that people are starting to get a little bit irritated by whatever this rumbling is. Okay. Okay, I'll use myself as an example. I remember decades ago watching a video. I believe I was either in Oklahoma or in Columbia, Missouri. So we're talking prior to 2004 at the very least. I was watching a video of these researchers or documentary news reporters who were in the center of Pennsylvania, and they were turning on water faucets. And I hope we all know what a water faucet is. I just realized I'm using a very Northeastern term. Spigot? I don't know what you guys call it here. When you turn on water on your sink, basically. And instead of water coming out, fire would come out. I'm not even kidding you. And this was extremely disturbing to me on multiple levels. And at the time, I really didn't know or understand what they were talking about was causing that particular thing. But they gave me the impression that it was only in this one area, a very limited area. And so I didn't think too much about it until much later, probably about 8 or 9 years later, when we started talking about tapping into the Alaskan pipeline, when we started talking about the Keystone pipeline, when we started talking about getting oil from different places. And I was like, well, where are we going to just dream up oil? Well, of course, there's reserves. I mean, that's just, we know this, okay? There are reserves, so we can tap into those things. What I did not know at the time is what they now call, fracking is the part where they actually, in a cracker plant, um, you know, break shale down into oil. And however that process works. I'm not a scientist, but you take shale out of the ground, which is a type of rock. It contains oil. If you can get it out, it gets crude oil, and then you can refine it for energy. I think those are the sort of the steps there. Somebody else can correct me if they really know a lot about this. The idea of a cracker plant is named after the sound that it makes when the fracking process is going on. You hear these giant cracks or crackling sometimes, and so they call them cracker plants because that's where that sound is coming from in the process of production. Well, I don't know if you know this, but when you dig into the ground to get oil, you hurt the world around it. You hurt the environment. That's no. Same thing if you're pulling shale out of the ground, okay? If you're pulling shale out of the ground, if you're pulling any mineral out of the ground, diamonds, gold, it doesn't really matter. You're damaging the earth around it. So sometimes we have protections for that. And let me tell you how brilliant my home county is, okay? And don't laugh, this is true. The name of the county is Beaver County, Pennsylvania. And some of you actually may have heard of it because it's just north of Pittsburgh. And for some reason, Donald Trump liked going to Ambridge or Rochester or Aliquippa, which is, they're the old blacked out, for the most part, steel towns that are just outside of Pittsburgh in the county of Beaver, and so the county of Allegheny. That's where I come from. That's where I hail from. So I've watched on TV them talk about, the steel industry kept us alive. I mean, my grandfather worked for the steel mill. My grandmother was a teacher. My father worked at the steel mills in the summer times in between going to college, which he was lucky he was able to do, by the way. He was the first one in the family. And so there are a lot of economic issues in a steel town, even at that time when it was thriving. Okay. So after the steel went away, which was really about the time I was about 10, somewhere in the mid 80s, it was completely gone. You have burned out towns. You can still see them, Aliquippa, Pennsylvania being one of them. Or Bethlehem, Pennsylvania on the other side of the state. You could pick anywhere in Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, West Virginia. I mean, I could go on the list of all those states up there that have damage to them. Not hard. So after the steel industry went away, Western Pennsylvania was like, what the hell are we going to do for money? What kind of industry can we have? As part of the Rust Belt, what can we do? There's a lot of farming in Indiana. There's a lot of other industry in Illinois. But Pennsylvania, we were like, what are we going to do? And so what we ended up doing was they said, hey, you know what? This fracking thing, let's get in on that. Oh boy. So there was this big housing boom, right? People building houses, people building multi-family housing, like apartment complexes around the area of fracking. Great. It's what we did in the still boom too. Those apartments are from the still boom are now decrepit, unusable. They've been vacant forever, or people are, they're tenements, or people are, staying in them without permission. I forget what that's called. And they're slums. And at one point, they were these new, bright, awesome places to live when the steel industry was booming. And now they're dead. So we're like, ooh, let's try the other thing. Because if we were able to create steel, if there was chromium, um, iron, coke, if we were able to get a hold of all that and we were able to put it together and make steel, and we fired up the furnaces and we tempered the steel, then obviously there's some shale in our rock, right? So they're like, hey, let's start digging the shale. Let's start the process of fracking. So what they do is they go in and they stick gigantic metal poles and dig into the tops of hills and mountains to test to see if there's good shale in there. Now hold on to your horses. I hope you're sitting down for this. If you cut a gigantic hole into the top of a mountain, what do you think happens? That's right. It's going to collapse, or at the very least, you're going to have gigantic rock slides. Okay. Because we're not talking about like you stuck I don't know, a putter from golfing in there. I mean, this is huge. So, literally within 2 years, well, not even 2 years, it was like 12 months. My husband and me and our kids, we drove out to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to visit my mom. We were in Beaver County, and we went for a drive, and all was well. 12 months later, almost exactly, we went back for our summer visit, in June or July of that year. And one of them, I would call it a very large hill, perhaps a small mountain, but really just a very, very large rocky hill. Um, it wasn't there. It just, it was gone. It just wasn't there. I mean, we were like literally driving down the highway and I'm like, wait, where are we? This doesn't make sense. And the reason it didn't make sense was because that hillside, which by the way was right next to the river, was gone. Now here's the fun part. Not only was this a hillside near the river, our water supply, keep in mind, it is less than 2 miles. It is fewer than 2 miles from the first operational nuclear power plant on the same river. Now, I don't know about you. This sounds a little dangerous to me as someone who survived a lot of nuclear meltdowns. Okay, this is a little scary. Now, obviously, Shippingport, which is the name of the nuclear power plant, it didn't really cause any trouble ever. It was 3 Mile Island. It was Russia. It was China. It was never really something that was in my county, but there were definitely the effects of other events. But you get a little nervous when you have the first operational nuclear power plant in the country, and you're 7 miles from it, and you're home, and this mountain that they're using explosives on is right above it. And the river, which is the Ohio River, which by the way gives you your water supply, right? Because it flows into the Mississippi, which then flows into the Missouri and so on. Um, it's right there. And I don't know if you know about the history of Pennsylvania and Ohio. We've had entire lakes and rivers catch on fire because there was so much crap in them. They literally would catch fire. Now, it's not that way now, but I still wouldn't swim in the Ohio. You couldn't pay me enough to swim in the Mississippi. I lived by 3 rivers in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I would not get into any of them. There's one that's blue, there's one that's green, and they both flow into the one that's brown, which is the Ohio. Don't ask me which one is the Allegheny and which one, or the Youghiogheny and which one's the Monongahela, because I couldn't tell you which one's blue and which one's green. But the point is that when you can tell that much of a difference in water sources, it tends to be a little bit scary. So just knowing that there was this fracking going on and it was going to economically kill my mom's area, because she still lives in our old house. My sister lives in my grandparents' house, which is right there as well, and my aunt and uncle, and a good portion of my family live right there, right? So how are they going to survive this time? We've already destroyed it with still, they managed to survive. now the fracking comes along. Is it going to kill them? Is it going to be a problem? And what was it that that documentary was talking about a decade before all of this came to light? And that was, in fact, fracking that was leading to excess gas in the pipes, which was sparking and therefore causing fire to come out of water faucets. It was a very long story to demonstrate to you that new environmental issues can rotate just as easily as a social movement can. But our knowledge of what needs to be worked on in social issues tends to be behind schedule quite a bit. It takes a long time to really understand how big of a problem it is. The LGBTQA movement, the environmental movement, clean water, clean air, some other movements of, about education and so on, and certainly any civil rights. It takes us way too long to figure out we need to do something about it, right? Thus is the case with fracking, which I hope all of you at this point in your life have heard of. And I won't tell you what to think of it, because I will tell you that actually I just got kicked off of a text group with my family because we were talking about it, and I'm the only one who thinks it's really bad. And being in Missouri and near Oklahoma, where they don't allow fracking because the first time that they did, they had the greatest number of earthquakes in their history. That seemed problematic to Oklahoma. I agree with them. Missouri doesn't allow it. I'm not sure about Arkansas. I don't believe that they do. I mean, we're lucky they allow diamond mining down there, right? So different states have control over whether or not fracking is allowable or not. Pennsylvania's like, oh, hell yeah, come on in, do it. Why? Because there's an economic need for it. So the genesis really started almost 20 years ago. The genesis of this started 20 years ago when people started learning about fracking and what the impact is. And between that and the movement that we saw get fairly large about 4 or 5 years ago. And I don't know what stage it's in now. What I do know is that social unrest built after the genesis, because once people learned, really genesis is kind of that, people are starting to hear about it, but they don't really know what it is. Social unrest is we're learning more and more about it, and we're realizing it might not be a great thing for whatever issue that is. Then we move into really, what did I say? Social unrest. We really move into enthusiastic mobilization. And enthusiastic mobilization is that when the social movement is the most visible, right? Where you can see people holding protests like up in the reservation areas that are supposed to be protected up north. And I forget the name of that particular, that is terrible of me to forget the name of that particular area that's been set aside that for Native peoples that we were just trying to run through. Somebody can think of it. And that area, there were a lot of protests, just trying to get the government to not destroy the land there. That's social. That's not social unrest. That's enthusiastic mobilization. That's people actually doing things. The letter writing campaigns, the calling, the getting it on ballots if you can, in certain regional areas or on state ballots, etc., to become new law. Having your Congress people introduce it as law, as a bill, in order to get it voted into law. That's all enthusiastic mobilization. That leads you to, what do you do after that? The excitement dies down. People forget the name of the places, like me, where there was trouble. We don't completely remember why. Well, that's what we call the maintenance stage. It is the job of the movement, whoever is leading that movement, to come in and make sure that people remember it. Remember the Alamo, remember the fight we had for this, and remember that it's still a problem, in order to keep some sort of maintenance of the movement to achieve more than maybe you already have. The last one or the last one, termination. Um, did I get all those? Yes. The last one of termination is really problematic for me because termination sort of means, all right, we've gotten ourselves into the institution, that is to say, into the government. The EPA has been established, or we're no longer going to drill in these areas, or fracking has stopped in a certain location, et cetera, et cetera. Racism is gone. Man, we dream for that day, don't we? Any kind of ism is gone, is a dream. It's something that we don't think we can ever completely achieve. And hopefully we will. But for right now, we're doing what we call incremental change because for some reason we can't just radically change people overnight, right? You will often hear me say, particularly when it comes to political campaigns or social campaigns, you'll hear me say evolution, not revolution. Okay. Now, there's a lot of people in the world who disagree with that statement, by the way, but to me, things just move slowly. And if you don't have the patience for it, it won't stick around. If you have a failed revolution, everybody gives up, disperses, and goes home. But if you have something that's sort of evolutionary, then you have to constantly work on it. It's easier to keep people involved in a campaign like that. So I'm always about evolution and not revolution. Changing things slowly, even if it does mean incrementally, even if it's too slow, which a lot of things just are too slow for us, okay? But when you have something build slowly like that, you don't have a revolution that turns over, you have a more stable change. Okay, and this is true in political power grabs. It's true in social movements as well, because sometimes we can change something, we can fight for that change, and then it's easily undone if we do it quickly. One example of this is actually Roe v. Wade, right? They worked really hard to make abortions safe and a choice for women. And it took a long time to get that through all the way up to the Supreme Court. It gets up to the Supreme Court. Well, guess what? The Supreme Court's supposed to be ironclad. That's where everything, the buck stops, right? You're not supposed to be able to change stare decisis, the idea of precedent in this case. But that doesn't mean that there can't be another court case that comes along to reverse that decision. Now, some people will call some of the rules and some of the laws that we have, or some of the judicial arguments that we have, they'll call them sort of anchors, or they'll call them super precedents, which is a stupid word, but the idea being that it's a precedent that is held for so long that it shouldn't be changed. You cannot overturn it. A lot of these are protections of the First Amendment, with the exception of incitement of violence or threat to others, which would be Brandenburg v. Ohio, I believe. And actually, they just referenced that in the impeachment trial today. I don't know why, because of course Brandenburg does not apply to the president. But I mean, I know why he did it. It's just it's for citizens, it's not for presidents or other politicians, because they actually have more restrictions than your average citizen does. Okay. So some of these super precedents, Roe v. Wade, Brown versus Board of Education, probably the ones you've heard about, right? Not Stonewall. It was the events at Stonewall that led to the court case for some gay rights, not a lot, but a few. And I can't think of the name of that case. I'm sorry. But there are some that are considered to be sort of unseatable, right? So even when you get into the government and it becomes a law or a legal precedent or whatever, it's not over. Okay. Yes, you're part of the institution, but my guess is there's some more stuff that you need to get done. And that's definitely true with any of the civil rights movements. Sure. You have education opens up, right? You got desegregation. Fantastic, on school buses and in schools. What about the rest of the freaking world? right? And then you find, we fight for the separate but equal idea to be stopped, all the way back to slavery, and prior to that, abuse of anyone, particularly the abuse of darker skinned people that were native. And so we can trace way back to when we started fighting for more rights or protesting the status quo. What do I mean by that? Protesting the way things are right now to make them different. And the idea is to make them better. And so it seems to me that termination is never really a stage. So maybe I'm just willing to wipe termination out. But I'm willing to bet that some people could argue that there is such a thing as termination of a social movement. And that's actually what we're going to be talking about this week. But let me talk to you about what I mean by linear, cyclical, and cyclonic. So linear, I literally mean it starts in a beginning and it has an end, and that's that. You could see the beginning, the middle, and the end, and that's it. Maybe you could see those 5 stages, and that's that. And they happen in that exact order, and they happen in that linear, progressive kind of way. Okay, great. That's one way to look at them. Cyclical, which is what I sort of started to lean to when I was in my master's program, the idea that they would recycle themselves. Okay, so the environmental movement is based upon certain ideals or values. Those ideals or values have not been adopted by everybody, in the world or in the United States or in your state or in your city or wherever it is that you want it to be done. So what ends up happening is maybe one campaign terminates and then another one begins, but the movement itself is just constantly going through a rebirth of some sort. It's one thing gets settled, but a new thing is starting to come up as an issue. So a social movement can contain multiple campaigns. The quote unquote bathroom bills that we talked about are just one tiny part of a larger movement of equal rights for all, including transgender individuals and gay, straight, lesbian, transgender allies, etc., queer, questioning, etc., who are trying to get equal rights for all of those groups. Okay, so the bathroom bills were a campaign within this larger movement. And so multiple campaigns are usually pretty visible in a movement. And maybe there's a termination to a campaign, but that doesn't mean there's a termination to a movement. So maybe it just starts back over again. And that would be sort of the cyclical view, right? We would put sort of that idea of inception or Genesis at the top, and then, all the way back around termination, right back to Genesis, right? The third kind, which I prefer, is cyclonic. If you know how a tornado works, or a cyclone, as I'm sure most of you do, it goes around, but it makes a cone, right? Because it hits itself and returns and etc. You're not always going through all 5 stages. Otherwise, you would never have to worry about a cyclone being any bigger than, the ground, really. So what happens is it has to build itself by recycling what it picks up out of the water or out of the land that it's going over, right? So that cyclonic model looks like this. I believe firmly that there are movements that have some sort of genesis, but that genesis may have been 200 years ago. And that genesis has led to, at times, social unrest, into enthusiastic mobilization, into maintenance, and then it's gone back to enthusiastic mobilization for some reason, or it's gone back to that unrest because people aren't satisfied with how the movement has been going, and it continually refers back to itself, sort of in those 3 middle steps of the cycle. That's sort of how I am recently thinking about social movements and how they work. And like I said, we'll find scholars who agree or disagree with that. And there's certainly multiple ways to look at the success or failure of social movements. And honestly, in order to truly understand how movements work, there are 2 things that you need to keep up with. One, social movements and, studying them in the past or in the present, and just constantly revisiting what they look like. And looking at a lot of them. And the second is to understand the context of the time period in which they're occurring. Okay. So, for example, social media has changed social movements significantly. I'm not going to lie about that. That's just a fact. How is more debatable. And one of the things that people talk about a lot to me is hashtag activism. Like, what the hell is that? Just because I put a hashtag on a Twitter feed does not mean that I'm being active. It doesn't, how is that activism? And yet, I guarantee you there's some of you going, of course that's activism. Of course it is. Of course you can make a difference that way. So that is a sort of question that I have about social movements, especially when it comes to social media. Can you have a hashtag social movement? Why or why not? That is going to be your discussion assignment that I currently have listed due on the 17th, but will now be due on the 19th. Okay, February 19th by 5 p.m. I'd like you to answer the question on the discussion board of, can you have hashtag activism is how we're going to talk about it. You can talk about anything you want within that. And any of your answers are fine. I've had long debates on this. I've learned a lot about it since I started talking about it a few years ago. But think about it. Twitter's actually relatively new. Okay. But that means old activism doesn't look the same as new activism. And I want to know how we feel about that. Okay. So to review, there are, at least in this view from Stuart Smith and Denton, 5 stages of social movements. You have genesis, social unrest, enthusiastic mobilization, maintenance, and termination. There are multiple interpretations of how many sort of stages a social movement can have. There are those who will say there's no value in studying a social movement by stage, but I'm not really sure how else to look at it except chronologically with its successes or the campaigns within it. And obviously there's a difference between a campaign and a social movement over time. And so those are a few of the things I was hoping you get today, and the assignment that I'm going to put up due February 19th on Blackboard in the discussion area. Can you have a such thing as hashtag activism? As you can tell, I'm enthusiastic. I'm looking forward to your answers. All right, everybody, that's it for right now, and I'll be in touch soon.